So here we have next up on our comprehensive immersive sim list is Prey. And unfortunately for me, Prey was not spared from my arcane syndrome. I rented it back, I think, right after release in 2017. And as I mentioned previously, I had played System Shock 2 at that point, and playing Prey, I didn't really know what to expect. I had seen some people do some gameplay demos of it, like Let's Plays and stuff like that online, but I hadn't seen anyone play the full release yet, and it just looked interesting. I was sort of a fan of the original Prey. I had never finished it, but I'd played the first half or something like that. I was sort of a fan, and I was like, well, this looks different. I'm curious how it relates, and it's made by the people who made Dishonored, so I really liked that game. Well, I was starting to really get into Dishonored 2 at the time, so I was like, you know what, yeah, maybe I'll give this a chance. And I started playing it, and I was like, well, this is really just trying to be System Shock 2. And then, of course, when you see the heavy Art Deco influence to a lot of the architecture inside the station, I was like, well, this is just trying to be Bioshock. And then with a lot of the zero-G sections and all of this stuff outside the ship, I was like, well, this is just trying... And some of the enemies, I was like, this is just trying to be Dead Space, particularly Dead Space 3. And so I found it to be a bit derivative, and I was also trying to play it like System Shock 2, where I was using my wrench or whatever as a backup and trying to do the game mostly with shooting and engineering and hacking and stuff like that. And I was finding it extremely difficult because I didn't have an efficient way of dispatching enemies, and I had gotten all the damage upgrades for the guns and stuff, but I could just never keep ammo stocked, and the enemies kind of endlessly respawn in Prey as well. And I, to be honest, I wasn't understanding a lot of the game's mechanics and systems as well as I thought I was. So when I finished it, I was like, that it kind of sort of dragged on at the end there, and I wasn't really having fun, and it just felt like wannabe System Shock 2 with crappier shooting mechanics and no ammo anywhere. So I kind of wrote it off. I finished it and I wrote it off, and I was just like, okay, I'm glad I played it, but I don't think I'll ever play it again. Well, then I started watching some retrospectives not retrospectives, but more like reviews on Prey and people talking about its game design and things like that, and people sort of applauding it for being so kind of innovative and so on the cutting edge for certain things. And I was like, what are they playing the same game I played? So years later, I got it on sale, digital copy on sale, very, very inexpensive. And oh no, never mind, I got a physical copy, because I was like, you know what, maybe I'll check Prey out again, I'm kind of curious. So I got a physical copy, I think for like $10, and brand new too, by the way, which was crazy. I started playing it, and I said, you know what, let me do New Game Plus this time, because I didn't get to play with any of those alien powers before, so with the surplus of neuromods I'm going to have this time around, let me see how the game plays. And all of a sudden, using the Typhon abilities and the neuromods and all of these things, the game just suddenly clicked. And in addition to that, I was going into the game with a different mindset. I was constantly trying to find an edge or an angle over the enemy, rather than just trying to brute force it by getting enough ammo for my shotgun. See, the first time I played Prey, I would just rush enemies with my shotgun, which it's a viable strategy. It's not very efficient, and you're going to waste a lot of ammo because the enemies are very bullet spongy. But the next time I played, I utilized a lot more things like the glue cannon. I used it for traversal as well. I knew parts of the game where I was just like, yeah, I don't want to spend too much time in here. So I would make bridges, and I would try and get around certain parts of the game. And experimenting with how much of the game you can circumvent, or how much of the game you can gain access to that maybe you're not supposed to yet, or maybe they're trying to make it difficult by utilizing a combination of the glue cannon and the platforming mechanics and the jumping and the mantling in the game. It just opened up, and I realized, you know what, this is a game that's not going to stop me from playing it the way I want to play it. It's not really going to get in my way, is it? And the neuromod abilities are just amazing. They make dealing with large groups of enemies or whatever so easy. And then I started playing with all the different ways that you can sort of manipulate the game's systems to, as redundant as it sounds to keep saying, a lot of people say this, but to come up with creative solutions to obstacles and things like that in the game. I'll discuss a few of my favorites here right now. So for example, in the beginning of the game, there are a bunch of boxes stacked up near one of the doors. As you come into the main lobby of Talos 1, there are a bunch of boxes stacked up near one of the doors. And unless you have the, increased strength mod, you can't move the boxes. They're too heavy. But it's really hard to circumvent that door to get into it another way. You have to go through a lot more bullshit. So I had noticed that when you lay glue down in the game, it comes down as a little speck and then expands out like a foam or something. And I said, I wonder what the collisions are like on that expanding foam. If it has collisions the entire time it's expanding, or if it has no collisions until it has formed the full sphere. So I tested it out, and it seemed as though it had collision the entire time it's expanding, like it would in reality. So what I did was I found a crack in between one of the large boxes that was stacked and the box below it. And I took my glue cannon and I shot a piece of glue in there. What it did was it expanded, and it actually pushed the box that was too heavy for me to lift off the top of the box below it, and then it crashed into the next room, and I was able to get into the room using that. Another one of my favorite things that I did in the game was I was trying to get into this locked office, and I didn't have the patience to go hunt down the key code for the door. I just wanted to get in there right away. So I was like, well, what the hell am I going to do? It's force fields everywhere. Well, I noticed this little slot, like a bank teller's slot, in one of the force field windows of the security office. And I said, huh. And then I noticed a coffee mug, or it was a pen or something like that, on the desk inside of the security office. So I jumped up on the counter and I crouched. And then I looked at the pen, and I used the Typhon Morph ability to morph into the pen. And then because you have limited movement while you're morphed into certain objects, I rolled myself through the slot into the room and then morphed back. And that's how I circumvented the door. There was another time in the game where I was still, because it was New Game Plus, I had all my engineering skills from my first playthrough. So I was hacking tons of turrets. But as you add more Typhon DNA to yourself, or Typhon material to your genetic makeup or whatever, the security cameras will start to regard you as an enemy, and the turrets and things. Well, they kept spawning the little tiny mimics, and they kept spawning some of the larger Typhon warriors near this door that I used all the time. So I set up some turrets there. But what was starting to happen is they would just start shooting me every time I came, but I wanted to keep them there because they were helping me, It did get annoying, not annoying, but I got a little tired towards the end of going back to certain areas of the game and, having to fight all these monsters again. So I'm just like, all right, well, these usually kill whatever's in the room by the time I spawn into the map. So I left the turrets there. Well, I needed to get past the turrets, but I didn't have enough health to take all that damage and try and get behind them, because they don't turn around all the way. So I was like, what the hell am I going to do? So I saw this box of medical supplies, like a box of gauze or something like that, on the ground, just some sort of physics object. And I said, So I morphed in. I was like, I wonder if they'll identify me as Typhon, because I certainly am if I morph into the box. But the thing about the mimic ability that you have to understand is you're not turning into the object. You are switching places with the object, because the mimics have some sort of temporal and spatial access to nearby mirror universes and mirror dimensions, kind of like Elizabeth with BioShock Infinite. And so basically they just trade places with an object from another universe temporarily, and they have limited control over it, and then they can pop back into our universe when it's safe. So I'm not actually a organic being taking the form of this box of gauze. I'm switching places with the box of gauze. So the security turrets are not going to recognize me. So basically what I do is I morphed into the box of gauze, and then kind of like, I don't know, something from Toy Story, I just kind of like waddled along the ground till I got between the two turrets and then behind them, and then I morphed back. So I was able to get past the turrets without having to take any damage, and while also using my powers in a clever way. And I don't think it would have been as rewarding if there was just some cloak ability where it's just like, oh, you turn invisible. Like, that was definitely more fun and satisfying, to be this like moving sentient box of gauze to move past the camera or move past the turrets. But ultimately, my favorite sort of immersive sim experience, my immersive sim story from Prey, this was my second or third playthrough, was I was going for a no-kill 100% run. So I wanted to do 100% of the side quests and not kill anybody on Talos 1, any human beings. And I totally forgot, this is spoilers, but when you find Danielle's show, she warns you about someone who has taken someone else's identity and is like a sort of a psychopathic killer. And once again, spoilers, when you find out who that person is, they end up being the cook in the galley of the living quarters in Talos 1. So knowing that he was going to lead me on this friggin' goose chase and all of this other crap that I didn't want to do with him, and all these other things I didn't want to, because he basically, like, he tries to, he says, oh, the ice maker or whatever in the back is broken, can you go fix it? So while you're in there investigating it, he tries to gas you and kill you. But when you escape, he runs away, and then the rest of the game he lives you little audio diaries, and he taunts you, and he tells you to follow him here and follow him there, and it's just I just didn't have the patience for that. So he invited me inside the galley, and he was setting me up for the whole, oh, go check out the thing in the back. So I was just like, sure. I took out the shock gun, the stun gun, and I shot him with a full charge. So now he's completely incapacitated, and I'm like, great, fine. Anyways, when I complete my quest for Danielle's show, she's like, oh, you found out it was the cook? She's like, I want you to go kill him. And I'm like, oh boy. Well, see, I took a vow of no killing this run, so I don't know if I can help you, Danielle. But having that quest in my logbook just bugged me. It just bugged the hell out of me. And I was like, well, this is an immersive sim, so what the fuck can I do? Let me think about this. So I was like, he's unconscious. I can't kill him. Can I cause him to die indirectly? And I dragged his... First of all, he was near something flammable, so I tried to set fire to that while he was in the kitchen. Well, that didn't work, because they were like, well, you set fire to it, so he's dead. So then I took him out into the dining room, and I tried dropping him off of things. Maybe it's just like, well, gravity killed him. No, that didn't work. Then I tried to see if I could, there was a chandelier above him. I was like, well, maybe I can get that to drop and fall on him and kill him. I don't think I could get it to drop. And then I was like, well, what am I going to do? And I kept trying, this and that. And, I was like, well, maybe I can get his health really low. And then, I don't know, throw coffee cups or something that doesn't do a lot of damage, and see if I was just trying to cheat the game rather than think around it. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, hold on. The reason he doesn't die when you meet him is he's holed up in the kitchen. And as we've seen with every other NPC in the game, if they are left out in the open for too long, they're susceptible to getting killed. So I said, what am I supposed to do here? So what I did was I dragged him out into the middle of the beginning of the level, where a lot of Typhon usually spawn. And I left the map, and I came back. Well, they didn't spawn too many new Typhon in because I had just left that map. So it's just like, okay, well... So I left the map and I forgot about it. And I don't know, maybe like an hour later, someone said, "Oh, you need to go down to crew quarters again and pick up this diary or pick up this note." So I went back down to crew quarters, and when I walked in, all of a sudden the objective completed, because what had happened is I had left him out in the open, and the Typhon had seen him and they attacked him. And then I checked my stats, my player stats for the game so far, and my kill count for human beings was at 0. So that was one of those moments for me that made me feel like, yeah, immersive sims are fucking amazing. I was able to not kill anybody, quote unquote, while playing this game, but still complete a mission where I'm supposed to kill this guy, you know, because I personally didn't kill him, you know, and it's kind of, it reminds me of like that one of those end scenes in Batman Begins where he blows out the back of the train. He's like, you know, I won't kill you, but I don't have to save you. You know, it's kind of like that sort of logic there. It's just like, you know, I personally didn't pull the trigger or anything like that, but I wasn't going to stop him. I wasn't going to try and keep him in a safe place while there's monsters running about. And something else interesting happened. So I was part of that run, I was trying to save everybody that I possibly could from being killed. And I actually failed that personal objective because I defeated a mind control boss, but in so doing, one of the crew members that was under its mind control got too close to, I think I was using, or when it died, it exploded, and she got too close to it. So she took a bunch of damage, but she was alive. So I said, I was like, okay, everybody chill in the greenhouse. I'm going to go fix some other stuff. You try and get to the shuttle when you can. Well, again, one of the things that makes this game sort of immersive is it simulates a lot of stuff. You know, yeah, I'm sure once these NPCs reach a certain point, they teleport out and then they just load back in at a safe point near a shuttle or near an outpost or something like that where there are other survivors. But the game, I don't think the game just despawns them when you leave the area. I think the game actually has them try to travel to an exit point of the level. And if there are too many monsters in the way, there's a potential they could get killed. Now, I think for the most part, it's not an issue because most of the NPCs have a decent amount of health, so they're not going to die immediately. But since her health was so low, the minute I left the area, it said, hey, yeah, she's died. And I was like, oh, damn it. But it also kind of made the game world feel, for me, a little bit more believable because, you know, she was severely injured when I left her, and she wasn't able to make it. So it was one of those things that added, you know, because they didn't just like despawn the characters, they actually made them have to walk to an exit point of the level. It was more immersive, it was more real feeling because they still had to get from A to B, and if there was a mimic there or another piece or another Typhon or something like that, there's a potential that they could die. So even when you save people in the game, there's still a potential that they can die on their own once you leave them. You know, because whereas in other games, once you quote unquote save them, they're just good to go. You know, they'll just immediately despawn as soon as you look away and go wherever is safe. So I thought that was great too, that it Prey is one of the few immersive sims, in my opinion, that really straddles that line between the two sort of ways that immersive sims can go. You know, as I discussed before, the one way about building a real feeling, believable world that has all of these systems and simulation in it to create the illusion of a real place and get you totally absorbed in the world, versus a game that tries to simulate so many things to give you a ton of choice and a ton of freedom as you would in the real world. And that's the way they convey sort of the idea of realism, but it's really more about player choice and player freedom. And I think Prey really straddles the line well to have equal footing in both worlds. It is an incredibly immersive world that begins to feel real. I love the quest where you find everybody's character sheet for the tabletop RPG that they've been playing, and you use that to decipher a code to go into someone's room to use the code
to open a safe. I love the fact that on the mission where you discover that the cook, the guy who says he's a cook, actually turns out to be the serial killer. Well, before you actually have to go back to the mess hall and the kitchen to deal with the cook, somebody else sends you to go get, or I think the cook sends you to go get his award out of his room. And if you look in there, most of the place has been scrubbed of any evidence that would tell you who the cook is. But if you go into one of the adjacent rooms, you'll see a picture of one of the crew members with the cook during some sort of ceremony. And you'll realize, okay, that guy in Chef's Whites is totally not the same guy that's in the room. So, again, world building and realism and simulation to help you feel like, okay, this is a real place. And it also clues you in on what's coming up next. So that, I think that's why the game allowed me to be able to let the guy die in some way without counting negatively against the amount of human beings I killed in the game, because the game is also setting up for players the idea that maybe you should just knock this guy out. And not do what he says, because there's something really suspicious about him. Something's not right about this guy. So the game has so many little things like that, little storytelling moments, and I just love that one because it's not like I personally knew from my previous playthrough, but a first-time player who's really observant could actually figure out that this guy's dangerous and maybe they should just knock him out or kill him from the get-go. So I thought that was great too. And that, again, is a real world, because if he did murder the cook and steal his clothes, there should be some evidence somewhere to tell you, okay, this guy's not the same guy as the guy I'm dealing with. Every single person on the station can be accounted for. You can find and locate every single person on the station. In fact, there's an achievement for doing so. And that's another thing I like too, because in another game like System Shock 2, there would just be random dead bodies everywhere. Nameless crew member number 2. And while these people don't have any significant meaning to you unless you start to know them as characters and then they die later, they have meaning in the sense that Talos 1 is a station with a finite crew on it. Whereas in games like System Shock 2, the amount of dead bodies could be seemingly infinite, because they can just keep putting them, they're just set decoration, you keep putting them here, there, and the other thing. But by naming every single crew member in the game and giving you a location beacon for them, it makes them feel like real people, and it also makes the world feel like a completely real place, because that's how a real space station would be. They'd probably want to keep track of everybody in case somebody got sucked out an airlock. And they'd have a complete crew manifest, so that the bodies lining the hallways wouldn't just be random dead people. That would be Jenna, or that would be Tom, or that would be Laura. So it just makes the game feel like a much more real place. As other people who've reviewed the game have pointed out, for example, sometimes conversations will go on without you being in the room, and that again makes the game feel real. You can actually listen in on people gossiping about you, and I'm sure there's some sort of trigger or something, but the way that it's done makes it feel like the game doesn't know that you're there, and you just happen to be there and you're listening to. So it's as if the people are real, because they continue to have conversations and talk about you behind your back, even when you're technically supposed to be, like, you shouldn't be near any game triggers that would be telling the NPCs to do that. So instead of feeling like NPCs or robots, they start to feel like real people at some point. And of course, some of the other great things that Prey does that, it's sort of out Bioshock as a spiritual successor to System Shock, is it brings back things like player builds. It brings back things like a real inventory that you have to manage. And everything like that. And the other thing I love about Prey is that everything feels like it is where it should be in the game. There's an engineering section, there's a crew quarters section, and every major crew member in the game has their own. Every single crew member in the game has their own room in crew quarters, and then every sort of officer or somebody, they have their own suites in crew quarters. Once again, selling the realism of the game, and it's just a phenomenal game. it's a phenomenal immersive sim that, like I said, because there's absolute player freedom. I mean, you can turn into a goddamn coffee mug, for example, and sneak past enemies that way. You can do all the things I talked about before. You can play with tons of these systems to just there's so many problems of the game, like locked doors, hackable objects, security turrets that you have to get by, large enemies that you have to deal with, places that are out of reach that you have to restore power for. And the beauty of the game is you don't have to do it anyway. You don't have to restore the power if you don't want to. You don't have to deal with the enemy if you don't want to. You don't have to try and find a key code to the door if you don't want to. There's always another way to get to where you want to go or accomplish what you want to. And that's one of the beautiful things about Prey. And of course it gives you all this free, and then of course it can be a really fun game too when you play with the Typhon powers and stuff like that. You can set things on fire, you can use a kinetic blast, you can hurl objects at things, you can, all sorts of crazy fun powers you can have fun with in the game. And they're quite effective in combat too, so you do feel like kind of a badass playing with the Typhon abilities, and you're just like, why would I ever use guns? And then of course just finding ways to cleverly just get the things that you want or go to the secret areas or anything like that, it's just totally fun and totally great. So Prey is an amazing game, but I would say, once again, the caveat with Arcane games is if you do not want to fall prey, no pun intended, to Arcane syndrome, what you need to do is play these games multiple times. Prey is not going to present you, it's not going to show you all of its colors until you play it multiple times. And I would say Prey is probably good maybe 3-4 times before you've really exhausted all the resources and really seen everything the game has to offer. And one thing that I liked in Prey as well is that, it's got the same crappy stealth from Dishonored 2, but Dishonored 2's stealth is still more functional than a lot of the stealth out there in gaming today. And so, for example, I didn't even realize this, but you can actually use stealth against the enemies in Prey, and you can actually make a build very sort of System Shock 2 style, where you can use the wrench primarily. You can put in a bunch of mods and a bunch of upgrades to make it so that you are pretty damn deadly with the wrench, and you can sneak up on enemies and do a ton of sneak attack damage with the wrench. And so much like System Shock 2, you can do sort of a melee build as well. And I think you can even get a power that means that when you throw objects at things, you can throw them with like crazy speed and stuff. So you can start using objects you find in the environment as deadly projectiles and stuff like that. So just Prey offers just an unparalleled amount of player freedom, but also a ton of player immersion. And I think as the years go by, people are going to start putting it on that shelf up with things like Thief and maybe Underworld or Ultima Underworld as like a really solid example of what an immersive sim could be. Because as much as I love Dishonored and Dishonored 2, they don't have the same feeling of immersion that something like Prey does. Another thing that Prey does really well, Prey is a lot more like System Shock 1 or Ultima Underworld in the sense that it is one large continuous space, right? The whole game is essentially one open world. And so you feel like you are in just one space station. The space station doesn't feel like it's levels, it just feels like one open space. And it saves the state of the game world every time. So if you drop a bunch of cans on the floor in one area and then you leave and you come back 6 hours later, those cans will still be there. And you can go outside the station and you can re-enter the station at any different one of the places. And I don't know, it feels continuous. It doesn't feel, even though technically it is segmented into different levels, those levels all have the same spatial geometry relative to each other no matter where you are. So example, if you go, for example, if you go outside, you are actually looking at the outside of those levels essentially, because it has the same, it is the same size, it takes up the same space, it has the same geometry as the level does, as that part of the station does on the inside. So it just feels like one large continuous space rather than a bunch of different levels. And of course the ability to go outside really adds more of that dimension to really selling the idea that this is just one large open area for you to explore. And another thing about the game too is that it actually lets you venture pretty far away from the station into space, and all of the space stuff too is continuous. So another thing that Prey does really well in terms of the simulation and immersion aspect and player freedom all rolled into one that really like cements what immersive sims should be is that it just feels like one continuous open world. And so yeah, it's a phenomenal game, and yeah, like I said, I think it's going to sit up there with things like Thief and the original Ultima Underworld as sort of a pure expression of what the design philosophy of an immersive sim can be. Because as we've discussed with some of the other games on this list, some of the other games shift towards a different direction, or some other games make certain concessions. Like Bioshock makes concessions. Deus Ex doesn't really make concessions, but it's not as much about believability and immersion as it is about extreme player freedom. And so, yeah, that's why I think Prey is really, really special, because it's a very much a sort of purist's immersive sim without sacrificing the player freedom. Moving up next, I want to talk about We Happy Few. It's not actually listed on this list, but I think it should be. I think it stays true to enough of the immersive sim design principles to be considered an immersive sim. Unfortunately, it's a terrible game. But I think it deserves to be on this list because much more than many other games, I think it really embraces the immersive sim design philosophy. For one, there really is a large degree of simulation going on in the world. The world is procedurally generated, and so the way that characters behave and interact with it is largely on simulations of their AI pathing and their daily routines and things like that. There is a night and day cycle. AI is largely dependent on what's going on in the night and day cycle, and certain characters seem to have their own night and day priorities, things like sleeping or cooking or eating inside and then going out and perusing the streets. Things like that. And so time will just keep progressing as you play the game, so you don't really have control over when it's nighttime or when it's daytime. Time just keeps progressing and it keeps marching on. Another thing is that the game endeavors to give you a lot of different ways to accomplish the objectives. Maybe not in terms of what you do in the mission, although that can be true. There are missions that can be accomplished by doing different things. Let's say someone needs a part to finish this machine. You could go retrieve it from a certain place, or you could maybe bribe someone for it or find it somewhere else. These instances are a little bit fewer and far between, but they do happen. Another thing is that there's not a lot of scripting when you're actually in the city and asked to go from A to B or asked to go find different places. It's all just a sort of simulated ecosystem, much like Bioshock, that you're just supposed to figure out. Of course, the lack of, I don't want to say scripting, but the lack of sort of thought-out level design and thought-out level architecture is really problematic to the game, because it's all procedurally generated, and then of course the AI is supposed to, the AI of the NPCs populate the map, and then they're supposed to create the sort of general ecosystem that defines how Wellington Wells feels. But again, the procedural generation can get in the way of that. Also, an issue with the procedural generation is it will keep recycling the same NPCs to put into the environment. But it does give the player a significant amount of freedom in terms of how they want to approach the game. You can go with a stealth build, you can go with a combat build, you can go with a build that uses a lot of charisma and has sort of a silver tongue to be able to play the game sort of how you would like to play it, or to accomplish certain objectives or to convince certain NPCs to help you. In some but not all levels of the game, there are usually multiple pathways to get to your objective. So like you can go through vents, or you can try and find key codes to get through doors or whatever, or you can try and come in through the basement or things like that. You can craft a variety of different weapons. So if you want to incapacitate enemies with some sort of gas or shot grenade or something like that, you can craft something like that. Or if you'd rather go more full frontal combat with like a melee build or craft really devastating melee weapons, you can do that sort of thing. There's a social stealth element, so you have to in the town of Wellington Wells, you have to take this drug called joy. So managing your joy meter is a sort of immersive aspect and that they put into the game to try and push the idea of this fanatical town who is obsessed with under force of law the consumption of this drug that keeps everyone in a state of sort of blissful ignorance about anything, and so you really have to manage like how much joy is in your system and things like that, and you can overdose on the joy. One of the more immersive aspects too is that it has survival mechanics in that you have to eat and sleep and drink water, and you will have meters for all of these things, most notably of which is water, where I believe you can get sick if you drink contaminated water from the outside of town, although I may be wrong about that, but yeah, I believe you can get sick and then you have to find like antibiotics and medications to cure yourself. But in addition to that, if you use the water in the town, well, the town government has laced the drinking water with this drug as well. So if you need to top off your thirst or whatever inside of Wellington Wells, I mean, be prepared to get a massive dose of joy as well. The interesting thing is that this can also be used to purge your system because it gives you such a massive dose. If you make it to these little safe houses you can find around the world, so that, you know, let's say you need to get off the streets because you're about to overdose and you need some time to recover from your joy overdose, you can go into one of your safe houses, go drink from a sink. That'll put you into absolute overdose mode, which results in an immediate burst of the effects of joy, which lasts a little while, but then immediately you start vomiting profusely and you get severe withdrawal effects for the drug. And like I said, you know, there's an eating mechanic, food mechanic, and a sleeping and rest mechanic as well in the game that necessitates the use for sleeping. And of course you can, much like in Far Cry 2 or other games, you can use sleeping to advance time if you'd rather go out during the day or out during the night. You get different skills. They can help with things like stealth or melee combat, or what kinds of things you can craft. I think even inventory size can be increased with different upgrades, but some of the most important upgrades have to do with social stealth. One upgrade, see, typically with joy, you kind of have to just walk this sort of jaunty little walk, and you're not supposed to run because it'll tip off the police and they'll get suspicious and start chasing after you. But one of the perks allows you to run through the city with impunity, and I think one of them I don't think any of them require you or reduce the requirement to take joy, but just being able to run through the city and also be on the streets at night massively improves how the game plays. So whatever build you want to go for is totally open to you. So there's a fair amount of player freedom, and that's basically all the game has of any note other than the story. The story, in my opinion, is phenomenal. And I think some of the immersive sim aspects work. I just don't think that the procedural generation lends itself to this kind of game, because in every other immersive sim, the game world has to be carefully crafted to make it interesting. One of the issues with the world of Wellington Wells is there's all these immersive elements put into the game, and there's some, simulations, like there's some pretty good simulations with AI and things like that, and, like I said, the day-night cycle and sort of these eating and drinking mechanics and things like that. It has a fully interactable 3D physics objects in the game. I like that there's a mantling system for climbing. So you can definitely see the immersive sim influence, and there's no doubt that this is definitely wants to be lumped in with the immersive sim category. The issue I have is that there's just not a lot of depth to the world. In procedurally generating the world, essentially what they've created is, instead of city streets lined with houses, they've created city streets lined with those super large sort of freeway walls that just look like houses. So it's completely devoid of depth and life and character in most places, and the few houses that you can go into, explore, break into, or shops that there are typically not worth going into. There's nothing of note in there, and you're risking more just by trying to be there and do anything than you are accomplishing. The game does some things right, like I said, the story. The other issue I have with the game is that while I think it's worth playing for the story, it is like a 40 to 50 hour game, all in. That's a lot to ask of someone when the game... See, the game at its core is just boring. It's boring and frustrating. Boring and frustrating, and all the level design is just superficial. There's not like a lot of, like I said, depth going on there. It's all just set dressing. So, yeah, and then in addition to that, I didn't even do tons of side quests or exploring the sort of world outside of the town of Wellington Wells, because with all of the survival mechanics, it's too much bullshit to ask the player to go through, because they have to spend resources going out and finding the stuff. They have to risk dying in combat. They may not find anything of value out there. So it's just, yeah, I mean, and it just feels like this big, empty, dead world with very boring gameplay as a result. Yeah, so while it's not a great game, I think it's fair to put it in this category, because I think it does enough things that, you know, its peers and predecessors in immersive sims have done to sort of qualify it as definitely an immersive sim. Moving on here on the list, we're coming to the end of it, but I'll be talking about just a few other games as well. We have Underworld Ascendant. Underworld Ascendant, for those of you who don't know, is made by a group of people who were largely the backbone of the founding of Looking Glass, especially Paul Narath, who actually did found Looking Glass Studios. Him and Warren Spector, and a few other veteran programmers and designers who were also integral members of the team that designed the original Ultima Underworld. And Underworld Ascendant is absolutely supposed to be a sequel or continuation of the Ultima Underworld or Underworld franchise. Underworld Ascendant is definitely an immersive sim because it comes from the people that made the original Ultima Underworld, that coined the term, that set down the design documents and the design philosophy that has guided this family of games ever since. And Underworld Ascendant is no different. Underworld Ascendant takes a lot of cues from Ultima Underworld, of course, because it's a continuation. Things like the ability to cook food, manipulate physics objects, use a variety of different spells and tactics to get past things like doors and gates and different obstacles, use things like acrobatic ability, flying and levitation, and modifying your agility and jumping abilities, being able to wall run and jump super far, all of these different things that you can use to traverse the environment or get past things like doors and obstacles or traps with ease. It has, much like the original Ultima Underworld, just a phenomenal magic system, probably one of my favorite magic systems in all of gaming, and I think this one is even better than the one in Ultima Underworld because they give you a much deeper mana pool, and the mana cost for most spells is significantly reduced, plus it's typically easier to figure out. The game won't outright tell you what the spell does, but it's typically easier to figure out what a spell will do based on the runes used to build the spell. So the way the magic system works is you're given a bag of runes. Each rune stands for a word. That word has 1, 2, or 3 associated meanings, and based on your combinations of words, you're sort of speaking the runic language. As a mage, you will have things happen. So, like, for example, one is like fortify or something like that, and then one is like person. So if you fortify person, that would be like healing a person. And basically the way that some spells work is the spell will seek a target, and if there are no targets that are not the player around, it will target the player. So you do have to be careful, because there's also a damage person spell. And if you cast that and there's no enemies around, you'll just take out a chunk of your health. But you can heal yourself that way and things like that. And so basically, you can just start playing around putting different runes together, being like, is this a spell? And then you try and cast it, and it either is or it isn't. And then if you determine that it is, then part of the other fun is, okay, what does it do? Now, based on the words that you used, you probably put them together in a certain order expecting something. So you probably have some sort of good idea of what the spell does or could do. But of course, part of the fun of the game is actually going out into the underworld and experimenting on an enemy or on a object or something like that. One of the spells I like the most, now I've never been able to get it to work right, but they did show this off in one of the E3 trailers, is Move Wood. And the way they showed it off is that there's this pedestal with treasure or something across the chasm that the player's trying to get to, and there's a bunch of boxes next to them. So what they do is they use the Move Wood spell on the boxes, and the boxes levitate and float towards the other side of the chasm, and the player can use the boxes as a makeshift bridge to go over to the other side. Also, because the game has a much more robust physics engine, obviously, than Ultima Underworld, you can do things like if a switch is really far away, you can shoot an arrow at it, or you can throw a rock or a cup or something at it to flip the switch to open the gate. And this actually reminds me of being able to open the portcullis of one of the towers in Ultima Underworld from the inside using a rod. You pick up the rod and you stick it through the grate and you can flip the switch. But the magic system is really, really deep in this game, allowing you to do a bunch of different stuff. Another thing that this game does really, really well is it has a almost Far Cry 2 level of fire propagation system. If something is made of wood, you can set it on fire. And it sort of introduces this in the beginning of the game in a smart way. So while in Ultima Underworld, kind of one of the clever ways to get around locked doors or something like that would be to just break it down by hitting it with a sword or just beating it with your bare fists. In Ultima Underworld, most of the doors are made out of wood, and so one of the things that you can do is set the door on fire and just burn it down. And you can burn down bridges, and if you... I remember there was this one sort of fortress full of a bunch of skeleton warriors, and I didn't know if I could fight them all. And much of the fortress was made of wood, so I cast a fireball, and the way the fireballs work in this game is it's literally just a ball of fire that appears before you, and you can pick it up and throw it like it's a baseball or something, or you can hold it and then take it to things and use it to burn them down. So I threw the fireball at the fortress, and it started as a tiny fire, and then like 20 minutes later it was this raging inferno that was just killing everything that was inside that castle, and that was a cool moment. It absolutely tanked my frame rate, but it was cool nonetheless. I love the different amount of ways you can kill or deal with enemies in this game. Like, for example, one time I held one of the flaming orbs out, and I kept dodging the enemy's attack, and then I kept just like shoving the orb into his clothes, and eventually he caught on fire, and I killed him like that. Using magic spells to spawn in friendly allies and stuff like that to fight for you, or area of effect damage attacks. And much like in the original Ultima Underworld, the magic system is not just offensive and for the occasional heal or something like that. It is also highly utilitarian. So for example, there is a spell called Flutter, and if there's a gap that you just can't jump because it's really, really far, you can use Flutter, and what Flutter will do is kind of keep you sort of levitating for a while, as if you're walking on flying doves or something, and you'll just kind of gently, gracefully glide across thin air to the other side where the ledge you're trying to get to might be. Another great spell is Teleport. Teleport is great because there are some doors in the game that are going to remain locked until basically the end of the game, and you're not necessarily going to be keen on going back to like the original dungeon in the game to use a key that you get in level 7 or something. So but a lot of these doors are separating secret rooms with walls that have like iron and metal grating for the windows. So what you can actually do is, as long as you can see a teleport location, you can teleport through walls or grating or whatever and get in there and grab the loot from the secret room before you're even supposed to, before you have the key to enter that room. Another thing you can do is spawn traps. This is a pretty cool ability. Say, you're running up a narrow ramp and you have a number of bad guys chasing you. You can spawn a trap right in front of you as they're coming up, sort of Dark Messiah and of Might and Magic style, and have them come towards you and then just get eaten up by the trap and things like that. Additionally, Underworld Ascendant allows you 3 basic classes, but you can kind of mix and match elements of whatever you want for those 3, and each class has a lot of different upgrades that they can do. So, for example, there's a stealth class and a fighting class, and the stealth class plays a lot like the game Thief, and they even included water arrows and the ability to extinguish light sources, and they even added a sort of visibility gem to the game. So the stealth is incredibly functional. You get massive backstab damage and things like that. One of the things I thought was a great inclusion to the game was just the agility upgrades. You get the ability to jump super high, you get the ability to run on walls, you get the ability to have a double jump, you get the ability to hit the jump button right before you hit the ground to sort of slow your fall so you don't take any damage. And so basically, with a maxed out agility character, you're almost flying around the map, and no one can touch you, and you can jump almost as high as some of the highest elevations in the game without needing an extra spell or to stack boxes or anything like that. I haven't done a complete fighter build yet, but I do like that they've added things. So the fighting at the beginning seems very boring, just hack and slashy, but one of the things I like about this game is it really emphasizes the idea of progression. You don't have to spend a lot of points to completely change the feeling of your build. For example, I used to think that the melee combat sucked in the game, but it's actually fairly nuanced and fun and responsive. It's just that if you are not a fighter class, of course you're going to suck at melee combat, and it's going to feel clunky and crappy. But I noticed as soon as I started sinking a few points into melee, all of a sudden it felt very responsive, it felt very slick. I was able to block, I was able to parry, I was able to look for opportunities where my opponents were slightly off guard and shove them to stagger them. I was even able to sort of in the fight position enemies close to a trap or something like that, and then use the shove mechanic to push them into the trap or push them off a ledge into lava or something like that. So and the same thing with magic. Magic may seem very limited and very crappy and like everything has a really high mana cost, but if you keep investing in that build, eventually a couple of progressions later, all of a sudden you're going to be able to do things like use only magic for combat and take on like hordes of enemy with nothing but spells, and you'll never run out of mana. And so it's got this really great progression system, lots of simulated things in the world. Like I said, I think one of the biggest strengths of Underworld Ascendant is that mechanistically it is a worthy successor to Ultima Underworld, and it is really in that sort of player freedom immersive sim territory, close to, not to the level of like Dishonored or something, but it's definitely emulating that. Like we want to simulate a lot of things, we want a lot of interactable systems, and we want them all to just kind of play together and let the player go nuts. It's got a very robust physics system that all different play styles can utilize very well. It's got the dynamic lighting system and a pretty complex light and shadow system to allow for players who want to play more stealthily to do a stealth build and hide in the darkness. It has the light gem mechanic. It has some of the cooking mechanics and things like that from the previous games. I believe it has some weapon degradation mechanics and things like that, like in Ultima Underworld. You can do things like you can use different things like different leaves or different foodstuffs that you find in the world, and you can feed them to these slugs that are going around everywhere, and depending on what you feed them, they'll have different effects. So for example, their slime trail can be made flammable, and you can use that to your advantage in combat. You can kind of send a slug towards a group of enemies, or get it to go towards a group of enemies after feeding it one of these, and then when they attack, you can set it on fire, and they'll all go up. As I said before, the fire propagation system is great. You can upgrade your fighter's ability to hurl objects, so you can simultaneously set objects on fire and then hurl them at enemies to do massive damage. As I said, it's got an incredibly deep and satisfying magic system that has equal parts offensive capabilities, equal parts restorative capabilities, and equal parts utility. You can do things like open doors, fly across maps, spawn enemies to help you, spawn traps to assist you in combat, give yourself temporary armor. You can spawn things. You can spawn things like more gold for yourself. You can spawn things like weapons for yourself. You can spawn all kinds of things. The projectile weapons in this game work way better than they did, obviously, in Ultima Underworld. You have the ability to massively upgrade your character to be super agile with, like I said, the running on walls and swinging off ropes and double jumping and you know, sort of slowing down in midair as you come down to a landing. And you still have the ability to break down doors if you want to. You can even use a spell to move the wood of a door, which will just sort of slowly break it over time. You have spells to turn enemies into your allies and fight on your behalf. You have all sorts of... So I think for me personally, the mechanics are all there for a great sort of fun immersive sim experience, a sort of sandbox where you can just go nuts playing with the different systems and seeing how they interact with each other. I think the shortcomings of Underworld Ascendant are the level design just doesn't seem to facilitate this super well sometimes, and in addition to that, it can... I wouldn't say it's buggy in the sense that it like doesn't work. I would say it's buggy in the sense that the systems don't always interact in meaningful ways. And so you will have to be forced to use more rudimentary methods sometimes, you know. Like, so for example, spawning a trap in front of enemies as they come towards you, sometimes the trap just won't do that much damage, or it'll ignore damage or something like that. Things of that nature. But I also think that they just didn't have enough time to make the underworld feel sort of really lived in and real. And so it can be immersive at times, but at other times it's not. And some of the systems in the game just aren't there, and also there's some... It feels very much like Ultima Underworld, but it's definitely missing some of the depth that game had. I will say that the most recent iteration of the game is much better than it was on launch, the vanilla version of the game. And if you're a fan of immersive sims and you liked Ultima Underworld, I would recommend playing it. It's got a lot of merit. And I would say this, the one disappointing thing about the game though is that because the mechanics and the systems are so good, and a lot of them are very well implemented, it's sad that the overall level design and sort of game design does not really make use of these systems very well. And as I've discussed before on this channel, this was largely due to the fact that while making Underworld Ascendant, basically all of their funding fell out after the first few months, and the game was in development limbo for 2 years with nothing being done on it before being rushed out in between 9 and 12 months before release, just being sort of rushed. And so, and I think the way that Other Side likes to do things is to develop systems and mechanics first, and then try and build the levels, because with System Shock 3's most recent sort of troubled development cycle, that's what a lot of the people who were working on the team said, is that, you know, the things that they were behind in weren't sort of the core things. Like their core systems, their core mechanics, their core gameplay was all figured out. He said that was pretty much done. The things that they needed were actual like level construction and asset development, which aren't as difficult in terms of technical sense, because you don't have to invent the technology or whatever, but it's difficult in terms of a manpower and man hours sense, because it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of manpower to construct all that stuff. So yeah, Underworld Ascendant, I think it strays a little bit from some of the purer definitions of an immersive sim, but largely it's there. You're selecting your own build, a deep sense of an immersive world, a world that's trying to get you lost in it with a lot of immersive elements and a lot of simulated systems that are supposed to make the whole experience more believable. But I think Underworld Ascendant is still erring more on the side of being about player freedom and player choice, and I think that's, again, one of the positives of this game, is that this game, much more than many other immersive sims, So it's a little bit more like Dishonored or something, or maybe I Divine Cybermancy, is it's really meant to be sort of a playground. The objectives are kind of just there, and it really is meant to be more of a playground, and with a heavy amount of encouragement for you to play with the systems, play with the mechanics. And I think this is really evidenced in the fact that in most games, including Ultima Underworld, if you want to progress, what you have to do is gain XP. And one of the lame things about Ultima Underworld is that the only way to gain XP is just by killing stuff. So you don't gain XP by like making new friends in town. You don't gain XP by like learning the lizard language in the swamp area of the Underworld. You don't gain XP by finding like secret areas or completing side objectives or finding one of the talismans of Kybyrus. You don't get XP for any of that. You get XP for killing shit. Which is why if you're a person like me and you want the maps clear, so that you can just explore them freely without being bothered by like bats and lurkers and shit, you will probably be almost max level by the time you get to the 4th dungeon in the game, which is only halfway through the game, and not even halfway because you have to do a lot of backtracking. So that's typically how most progression systems work, is that you get XP from doing stuff, completing objectives, killing things, whatever, and then you apply them to your upgrades. The way you get XP or upgrade points in Underworld Ascendant is by performing what are called feats, and feats are just basically, are you making use of the game's systems and mechanics? And when you do things that are non-conventional, because you were using the game's mechanics, the game awards you perk points, which you can buy new skills with. And that really evidences that they didn't want this game to be about like arduous dungeon crawling or resource management like a System Shock game where it's like there's a large emphasis on scarcity or anything like that. They wanted this game to be about just having fun. And that's why I think they gave you a deeper mana pool like at the start for your magic system. That's why they give you plenty of runes at the beginning of the game. That's why they teach you a few spells so that you can do things like experiment with the magic system and learn new spells and teach yourself how to extrapolate on what you know to develop new spells and see if it's an actual spell in the game. That's why they teach you to utilize things like traps to kill enemies and lure them in. That's why they teach you to constantly think about what's in the environment, what's a different way that I can do things. So it's really just about like have fun playing with the mechanics, be creative, and utilize all the mechanics and systems that are here for your benefit and for your enjoyment. And I also like, I don't know if this was intentional because it could be that the story and sort of plot and characters were a little bit underbaked. I mean, if you compare it to the original Ultima Underworld, which had a lot of side characters with their own backstories and a lot of dialogue and dialogue trees and everything like that, where Ultima Underworld has none of that. There's maybe in the current build, there's maybe 3 or 4 characters. And they have a little bit of backstory and they tell you some stuff, but then that's about it. But one of the things that I sort of like is it's a very laid-back game. It doesn't take itself too seriously. And it could be because the plot was a little underbaked, but I like to believe that because they just wanted this to be a really fun experience about exploring not only the abyss, but exploring what the game has to offer in terms of mechanics and systems, that I think that the reason it's very laid back and less intense in terms of story and things like that is for that same reason. So yeah, Underworld Ascendant I would definitely recommend. I would keep your expectations tempered. It still has some issues, it's not perfect, but if you just go into it with the expectation of like, okay, the level design's not going to be phenomenal, it can feel a little empty sometimes, and I'm just here to play with all the fun toys. If you go in with that mentality, I think you're going to have a better time than if you're expecting like Skyrim Underground, because they're just not going to get that. But regardless, I think it is a really fun immersive sim, and I think I think if it had a little bit more time to cook, it would have been a great sort of return to form for Otherside and really ushered in a new era. And speak of a new era, in capping off this comprehensive list of immersive sim games, I want to talk about a few upcoming games that are going to be very exciting for the immersive sim category. Since I haven't played any of these, I'm not going to be going into as much depth or detail about them. The first obviously being the System Shock 1 remake. It's done by Night Dive Studios, and just recently they released their newest, I think it's their alpha build now, and it's also in it's an Unreal Engine build. They were previously in Unity. And so far, it really feels awesome, and it is retaining so much of the feeling and it's retaining so much of the control over your character and the control over the gameplay that you had in the original System Shock. Like, for example, one of the things I loved in the original System Shock, because it was very novel at the time, was the ability to select what kind of ammo you wanted to use. If you wanted to use hollow points, or flechette rounds for like fleshy targets, and then maybe like armor piercing or shock rounds for robotic targets, you would think about, okay, I'm going to use that. So you had to switch ammo types. Another thing I really loved was the spark beam, which, let's face it, it's just a Star Trek phaser. So the phaser in the game, you can set the power level, and it's not just like low, medium, high. It's a gradient in the original System Shock. So you can increase it by degrees to find that sweet spot where you're like, okay, now I'm doing enough damage, but I'm not spending too much energy. And lots of these things have come back into System Shock Remake. Also, it's got a grid-based inventory, thank God, and much like in System Shock 2, the trade-off to being like, okay, this is a purely mouse-lit game, was that, okay, well, if you want to use your inventory, you hit tab, and then it goes into cursor mode, where you have a mouse cursor to select and manage your inventory. But I think the game does not pause behind you when the inventory is open, so you got to be careful when, much like System Shock 2, you have to be careful when you open your inventory. And you can set, now it is a low, medium, high setting for the phaser in System Shock Remake, but that's fine. It's whatever, it is what it is. But basically what happened was I played System Shock Remake, the demo, and then immediately after I installed Enhanced Edition to play MedSci in that game, or the Medical Pavilion in that game. And they really got the feeling of the game down, but there's much more of a horror bent to it. I do miss the original soundtrack. I wish they would have done sort of a rendition on it, but they're going for a much moodier, sort of creepy soundtrack with this one. I found myself also having to do things like use the combat stims and things like that. I love the look of the pistol and look at some of the weapons with the little ammo counters and stuff. I love the sort of minimalist HUD. I love the fact that it is heavily about resource management and things like that, because and strategically using things like the cyborg reclamation chambers and things like that. So it looks to be very faithful to the original, and I can't wait for the full release. It's going to be so great. So I think Night Dive really is nailing it with this game, and I think they're going to be giving fans exactly what they want. So I'm very excited for System Shock Remake. Next up, we have System Shock 3, which I just did a sort of news report on this channel about, and we don't really know much about System Shock 3, and at the current time we don't even know. We had high hopes for it before because it was being spearheaded by Warren Spector, and it was being done by Other Side, essentially Looking Glass 2.0. But the issue we're having now is that they fired their entire development team. They said they're going back to the drawing board. It's unclear. They were originally developing in Unity. It's unclear. One of their vice presidents of marketing, who no longer works for them, made some sort of comments on the forums about switching to Unreal Engine. But then again, the more I pour over that comment, the more I realize he may actually be referring to a unannounced IP that the company's been working on. So maybe they've decided to use Unreal for that, but stick with Unity for System Shock 3, or maybe he was talking about System Shock 3, or maybe he was talking about both. It's really unclear. There's not a lot of transparency with Other Side. I think ever since they started having severe financial problems with Underworld Ascendant, there hasn't been a lot of transparency with Other Side whatsoever. They're trying their best to let us know what they can, but right now they've signed a deal with Tencent, the Chinese mega conglomerate, to what it sounds like they're doing is they're either going to be outsourcing a large degree of development labor on things like I mentioned before, like asset development and basic level construction, or they're going to be co-developing in a much more back and forth way. It's really unclear what's going on, but it has been confirmed by other side staff that they are actually, so the people's fear at the beginning was Tencent was just taking over the entire project, but it doesn't seem to be the case. Other side is still involved with System Shock 3, and Tencent will be some sort of partner. I don't know if they're going to be a silent investment partner. I don't know if they're going to be offloading heavy labor to them, to heavy labor in the sense of like white collar computer labor. Like I said, asset development and stuff. I don't know if they're using their resources to just be like, well, we don't have the people to do all that asset stuff, so you do it, and we'll work on mechanistic stuff and story stuff. That's what it seems like so far, but they haven't really talked about anything thus far. So that's, I have a whole video on what we know about System Shock 3, so I don't know enough about what the game is supposed to be and what it's supposed to have in it to say anything more than that. All I can say is I hope Other Side figures out some way to keep it their own and release it, and hopefully not succumb to the same mistakes that kind of made Underworld Ascendant miss its potential. Moving on, we have Stalker 2. Stalker 2 has been announced. I don't know much about the development, and since I haven't even finished the original Stalker 1, I can't say. I mean, I'm excited for Stalker 2, sure, but I think I'd be more excited had I a better frame of reference from finishing Stalker 1. But revisiting a lot of these great franchises just fills me with happiness and a lot of hope, that we're going to be seeing a lot more immersive sims. And as much as I'd love to see Other Side kick it out of the park, I think people like Arcane and even as I pointed out before, like I think, indie studios need to realize, as Neon Struck pointed out, it's possible to make things that maybe they're not like super advanced or super deep immersive sims, but it is possible to make games like some of your favorite immersive sims without having to have a huge team and have a ton of resources at your disposal. So maybe games like Neon Struck and the upcoming Stalker 2, or games like I Divine Cybermancy, will inspire smaller teams to give working on immersive sims like indie-developed immersive sims a chance. So Stalker 2 isn't necessarily indie, but it's not. They're not like a AAA studio, the people that are working on Stalker 2. But so I hope we hear more about it and see some more gameplay coming up soon. A side note of a upcoming game that seems to be in the immersive sim genre would be Atomic Heart. We don't know a ton about this game, but it is a game that is heavily about. It's kind of like a underground Soviet bunker version of System Shock, where you're fighting rogue android robots in this Soviet research facility in the middle of the forest, and you have to do things like use melee objects, use physics objects in the game. You'll eventually get some weapons. There's lots of puzzle solving. It seems to be a sort of scarcity style resource management game. It's got highly advanced systems for light rendering, lots of ray tracing being applied to the game and stuff like that, which should come into certain game mechanics and puzzles. I think there's like a sort of endless mirror puzzle, or you can trip out the androids by playing with reflective surfaces and stuff. So yeah, I think it's definitely venturing into immersive sim territory. Whether it really sticks to the principles of that category of game or not is yet to be seen, but it's definitely a game I'm highly anticipating, and it looks to be very much sort of embracing that sort of immersive sim design philosophy. And as I said, it feels very System Shock-esque. Speaking of indie-designed immersive sims, we have something from Blendo Games. Blendo Games is something of a interesting anomaly. They made a game a while back called 30 Flights of Loving, which is kind of a interesting. It's like a little interactive movie. It's about you going on a heist and everything leading up to the heist and love and betrayal and things like that. It's only about 30 minutes or so, but it has an incredible degree of storytelling and an incredible sort of tone and atmosphere for a game that is, you know, essentially just an interactive movie that's 30 minutes long. And I thought it was sort of like just some artsy-fartsy whatever project, so I didn't really pay it that much mind. I ended up having it in my Steam library. I think I got it through a Humble Bundle, and it was, you know, I checked it out one day and I was fine. Anyways, people kept talking about this game Quadrilateral Cowboy, which is sort of like this, like, at least the way it was initially advertised was sort of like this hacking sim or something like that. Well, I thought that sounded kind of cool, so I bought it way back in the day, and then I never actually picked it up. But sometime later, I think it was around Christmas this year or something like that, I just decided, you know what, let's give that game a try. And except for a few missteps in general design, I would say, so it's definitely going to be like top of the list of my honorable mentions for immersive sims. You know, games that are heavily inspired by immersive sim design principles, so it kind of falls short of sort of the purer tenets of the design philosophy, and Quadrilateral Cowboy is one of the shining examples of a game that is really brushing up against being a total immersive sim and really embracing a lot of the core elements. I think one of the best things about Quadrilateral Cowboy is, with the exception of a few levels in the beginning, there is just an absolute amount of possibility and creativity that basically, I'm very proud of myself for circumventing, in the very final mission, which is supposed to be the hardest, circumventing a whole bunch of booby traps and bullshit and everything, just by being, just through ingenuity. I absolutely loved the game. I also loved that the game has a large degree of immersion to it, because you have to carry this laptop around with you, and then in addition to that, you have to carry around, like, if you want to use a remote camera or something, you have to carry around a little TV monitor next to you, and then on top of that you have to and every time you want to, you can actually, so basically what you do is you write code, and you can write scripts and code for all of your gadgets, because once again, it's a heist game, it's about stealing shit. So you set up all these robotic gadgets to do things, and sometimes you have to do things at a certain time, so you'll have different execute commands. And so basically you just write scripts for all of your gadgets to do things in a certain order at a certain time, or when it issued a certain command, and then you have them go one by one by one by one, and you create sort of a Rube Goldberg machine of sort of this cascade effect of awesomeness to be able to finally get to your objective, steal the thing, whatever. And the fact that you have to use an actual command line interface makes you feel like this master, sort of awesome computer hacker. Now, if you know anything about actual coding, you're not coding, you're just putting in commands. You're writing very, very basic scripts. They're not even scripts, they're just a series of commands that have a sort of a Go code or something. And once you've gone through 3/4 of the game, it kind of loses its luster. You no longer feel cool doing it, because you realize that what you're doing is essentially what you would be doing in a regular game where you would just click on buttons, because what is a GUI but just a visual representation of a command line interface? So the typing does get a little obnoxious towards the end, because you don't feel like a hacker anymore, because you know you're not actually hacking, you're just issuing commands in a computer terminal. But it's still a cool game, and what is great towards the end of the game, though, is the amount of depth of different functions and actions that you can create. You can create some incredibly complex series of actions and events, but you've broken it down very logically and simply, and so you understand every step. And so Quadrilateral Cowboy is a phenomenal game, and it just, like I said, it just brushes shy of being a complete immersive sim. And I think the reason it does for me is that there are a few levels that are a little bit like Portal, where there is one prescribed solution and you just kind of have to do it that way, and there's no other way to do it, and there's no room for creativity. It's the game's like, you have to do it this way, we're teaching you to do it this way, and no other way will work, and that's just how it is. So it doesn't give the player a lot of freedom in the first half of the game. You only get a lot of freedom towards the second half. And I think that's why, for me, it's not totally an immersive sim, but I am now a huge fan of Blendo Games, and so currently they are working on a game called Skin Deep. And Skin Deep seems to be, once again, a game about either infiltration or stealth or whatever, that has a large degree of simulation. I mean, just looking at the trailer right now, it includes things like having to pull glass out of your feet because you're barefoot or stuff like that, and there's a lot of stealth and sneaking and moving around guards, and there's light and shadow mechanics and things like that. So it's hopefully going to prove to be a really great example of sort of in the vein of Neon Struck, like an additional sort of indie immersive sim. And I would say compared to Neon Struck, Quadrilateral Cowboy shows it shows much more depth, much more promise of a designer who can create more depth off of, smaller projects. And this developer chooses to use id Tech 4, and I think it's because it's got really great lighting. There's some really great dynamic lighting and really great shadows and things like that. In Quadrilateral Cowboy, it's not super pertinent to the gameplay, but it's a great looking and feeling game. But Skin Deep, I think, is going to have a lot to do with light and shadow and stealth and things like that. And so I think actually the choice to use an engine that can be easily optimized for today's hardware but has all this great tech that people aren't using that kind of tech anymore is really, really smart, especially when graphics aren't super key. He doesn't have to make them Doom 3 level graphics to make a great game. The graphics can look a lot more like Neon Struck, but the actual engine is able to render things and do things like with light and shadow and physics and anything else that just weren't possible in a game like Neon Struck. So I think using the id Tech 4 engine is actually brilliant for this kind of work. And it shows that hopefully we're going to see this sort of like surge of indie titles sort of flirting with or experimenting with the immersive sim design philosophy. So I'm very excited for the game Skin Deep, and I can't wait to check it out. Another game, sort of indie immersive sim game coming up is called Synther. It promises to be sort of a Blade Runner meets Deus Ex with a large degree of immersive sim design influence, and a very sort of 1990s DOS or retro PC gaming aesthetic. It looks very cool. I don't know a ton about it. There's very limited trailer footage and things like that, but it's a project I'm following closely, and I hope to actually bring it to fruition. But I'm just pointing it out to once again sort of showcase that I think there's a lot of indie developers now that are realizing, hey, we don't have to make these uber complex immersive sims, but we can still make games like the games that we love in that genre. Finally, we have Shadows of Doubt. Very, very similar to the game I just described. Shadows of Doubt is a cyberpunk themed immersive sim. As the tagline says, it's a first-person detective stealth game set in a fully simulated sci-fi noir city. Now, when they say fully simulated city, that's exactly what it sort of looks like. The gameplay trailer that they have so far does showcase a massive apartment building that you live in, where you can actually, it seems that there are fully explorable apartments on every level of the apartment building. There are other buildings adjacent to you and down the block that you would expect would probably have a large number of apartments, rooms, and places to explore within them. The game seems to be about catching a serial killer on the loose in the city, and so it's probably going to be a lot of dialogue and talking to people and getting to know them and sort of sussing out clues and things like that. And it's probably not going to be a huge open world, but it's going to be big enough to where the depth of what is available in the open world is going to be quite dizzying, especially when you have to contend with sort of solving this murder mystery. But I really like the aesthetic. It is a little bit more Minecrafty than even Neon Struck, but it's got some excellent lighting effects, as it seems to be running on Unreal 4 or something like it. And, once again, it's just showing that I think there are a lot of indie developers that are catching on to this idea that they can totally make immersive sims themselves because they don't need cutting-edge graphics, and they can put a limit to like how many systems they want in the game and to what the point of their simulation is going to be. So they don't have to copy like Dishonored or anything like that. They could probably do something a little bit smaller in scope, but still in the vein of games like System Shock or Deus Ex or things like that they love. And of course, finally, the upcoming game that is a big deal that I think really will, it seems so far to be very, 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 very much in the vein of immersive sims is Cyberpunk 2077. We don't know a ton about the game yet, but already I can see that the game, I think, is going down the sort of Deus Ex route of just absolute player freedom. Tons of build options, tons of combat options, tons of non-lethal or sort of text and conversation-based options. It promises to be a game like that with a fully realized simulated city with lots of NPCs that hopefully will make it feel alive and lived in and things like that. Once again, we don't know a ton about the game yet, even though it's supposed to come out in September, but I have to say I'm very excited to play Cyberpunk 2077. So that's the end of this list so far. I realized I may have forgotten to mention things like Kingdom Come Deliverance, which you could totally make an argument about as to whether it's an immersive sim or not an immersive sim or what it's supposed to be. I think it's definitely closer to being one than not. But I hope you guys liked this sort of comprehensive rundown of, you know, the different immersive sims that are out there. And I'm sure that I forgot to mention games or haven't even heard of games that would be on this list. I made this video largely because I love talking about immersive sims, and I wanted to just kind of give my thoughts and sort of a short rundown and opinions and a brief overview of all these games, and of course kind of share this list with people because I think it's a fantastic list, and I think one of the great things that it does is showcase games that I have always felt, games like Far Cry 2 and things like that, that I have always felt like, yeah, you know what, they really are kind of in that category with all these other games that I love. And I think it really has a better understanding of what criteria would make a game an immersive sim than many other lists that typically just list, you know, Deus Ex, Looking Glasses games, and then Arcane, and that's it. As I said before, you know, I think Alien Isolation, for example, is actually a very pure distillation of what immersive sim design philosophy is all about, and so I think it was very apt to include it on their list. So I would love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments about any games that I may have missed, any games that you feel belong in the category, and anything like that, because this is just you know, it's a topic I'm really interested in. I wanted to share my thoughts, my general thoughts on a lot of these games. Doing full-on in-depth reviews of these games, it may take a while for me to get to some of these, and they may, you know, depending on how busy my life gets, it may never happen. So I just kind of wanted to do a video like this that just shares my thoughts and experiences on many of the most influential immersive sims, and then also gave me a sort of forum and a soapbox to talk about why I think some of the more non-conventional titles on this list really deserve to be there. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and like I said, let's keep the conversation going in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the games we talked about in this video, or any of the games that I missed. That's actually what I'm more interested in. What did I miss? Because I would love to know what I missed. I'd love to check out some games that I missed on this list. So keep the conversation going, and I will be back with more videos on different topics, especially immersive sims. I think some of the next videos I'm going to be doing soon, if you want to check them out. I finished my playthrough of Ultima Underworld, and so hopefully I will have not only a review of sort of the Unity copy, but kind of a larger, more in-depth retrospective on the game, my experience with it, and its general impact on the industry. So I hope you guys can look forward to that.